Hello, everyone. Last people coming in over there. Welcome. Can you sit down as soon as you can? And we will kick off. Thank you. We do have the air conditioning on. I hope it will begin to kick in. All right, welcome. I'm Bronwen Maddox. I'm director of Chatham House. I'm delighted to be having this conversation with Sir John Sawers, who is executive chairman of Newbridge Advisory, which he founded to advise companies and people about risk, of which there is a lot around, and had 34 years in the diplomatic and intelligence service, culminating in 5 years as head of MI6, and embedded as a nugget in that, as when he was permanent representative to the United Nations, there was a long 2 years, if I can put it that way, 2007 to 2009, of spending a great deal of time on the Iran nuclear deal negotiations. And I feel when I was a foreign editor of the Times back then, also spending a lot of time in those meetings in Tehran and Geneva, trying to get to a deal. We are not going to talk very much about history. We're going to talk about where the situation is right now with Israel and Iran. So, John Sawers, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Bronwen. It's great to be here.
Great. There's a lot of call, I would think, on your time at the moment for exactly these questions. Let me dive straight in with this question of whether you think it is right to say, as Israel is saying at the moment, that Iran was within a whisker of getting a nuclear weapon.
The hardest part of developing a nuclear weapon is mastering the enrichment cycle and getting enrichment to the level needed for a nuclear weapon. And the Iranians have made huge progress on that over the last 20 years. Where we had, and that's clearly catalogued and available through verification by the International Atomic Energy Authority. Where there was less certainty was exactly what stage Iran had got to on what we call weaponization, i.e. putting the nuclear device into a bomb which would explode after it's been delivered by a missile or by some other means. There was some uncertainty about that. We know that the Iranians have done a lot of work in the past on developing an actual weapon and not just on the enrichment cycle. And I think the most compelling part of the Israeli case, I don't agree with all of it, but the most compelling part of the Israeli case was that there was no justification for Iran's nuclear program at the scale, level of protection, the volumes, other than it having the purpose of developing a nuclear weapon. There are, natural uranium is less than 1% of fissile U-235. For a power station, you need to enrich that to about 4%. They've enriched 400 kilograms, I think it is now, to over 60%. That's very close to the 90% you need. And the only other purpose of having that sort of highly enriched uranium is some rarefied sort of medical treatments. And you certainly don't need to bury your enrichment site 80 meters underground in order to produce something for medical purposes. So the intent of the Israelis, the intent of the Iranians has always been clear that this has got a military purpose. But quite what stage they got to was not so apparent. And so the Israelis seized an opportunity where all sorts of things aligned for them to do this in a timing of their own choosing.
There's a set of specific allegations by Israeli intelligence which are being leaked out into the media at the moment as part of this debate, saying, and particularly on that first point of saying, look, the two teams of enrichment of this weapon and the missile teams had come together, and this was one of the two main things that Israel had found that made it think not now, that it had to be now. Do you find that persuasive?
Well, I don't know the details of what Israeli intelligence has. What I do know is that after the calamity for Israel of 7 October 2023, the Israelis have come back very forcefully, very powerfully, destroying much of Hamas's abilities to create a threat, dismantling Hezbollah, and having a surprising degree of success against Iran's own defenses. And I think the combination of that and Netanyahu, politically, the stars were aligning for him a bit better inside Israel itself. No elections until next year, for example, after the Knesset vote. So I think there was an opportunity here which President Trump didn't really want them to take. And it was only a week ago that he was appealing to Israel to allow more time for his negotiations. But Netanyahu brushed that aside, and Trump has basically fallen in line with the Israeli approach.
You take it. I'll come back to that point. Let me come on to the credibility, though, or otherwise, of trying to get rid of this program by a direct strike, by this 30,000-pound bomb that the world is now fixed on, and whether the US can deliver it or deliver bombs like that repeatedly on top of this mountain. And we were discussing just before coming on here how the highly enriched uranium does not take up very much space, and therefore is quite hard to get hold of. The amount you would need for a nuclear weapon is slightly bigger than a bowling ball, though it's heavy as gold. Can a bomb actually be targeted to do that?
Well, let's be honest, it would be better if we could have solved this through a negotiating process. That's been tried over 20 years, and I was first negotiating on this back in 2003. We won't go through all the history, but it's been a long and tortured process in which the Iranians have been consistently difficult, and the Americans have been inconsistent as well on this, first with a negotiated approach and then not. But now the Israelis have moved us into this space of a direct conflict aimed at dismantling Iran's nuclear program. They clearly cannot themselves destroy Fordo because they do not have the weaponry to do that. And I think it
Fordo is this mountain and the site
exactly
underneath it.
The most developed of the sites. There are several underground sites. There's one at Natanz, not quite so deeply buried. There's one a place called Pickaxe Mountain, which they've been developing as well. I think the Americans have got the capacity to strike all these targets, but of course any military operation carries an element of doubt. And an element of uncertainty. I think the Americans would probably succeed, but you cannot be absolutely certain that they'll be able to deliver 2 or 3 of these 30,000-pound bombs, these MOPs, massive ordnance penetrators, in exactly the same spot to get down as far as you need to get. So it does carry some uncertainty, but the counterfactual, the alternative to that, would be to leave the Iranian program where it is, leave a wounded, aggrieved, angry Iranians in a nuclear weapons program that is still largely intact. And I think that calculation would be, that outcome would be considerably worse than taking the risks of an American strike.
But isn't the point that one of the risks is precisely that, of creating that outcome? I mean, there are many, many countries in the world, some explicitly, like some European countries, some quietly, like some of those in the region, who would be delighted if Iran were parted from its nuclear program. But is there not a risk if the US, if Israel, helped by the US, cannot, from the air, get rid of this program, that you're left with exactly that, an absolutely enraged regime determined to go after these weapons?
Well, Bronwen, you're right, so there's some uncertainty about it, but if you don't do it, you're absolutely guaranteed that that's going to be the outcome.
So better to go on from this point.
Once you're halfway across the river, it's best to stride forward and get to the other bank rather than sit in the middle of the stream, getting risk of being washed away.
My colleagues at Chatham House will know I'm not desperately fond of metaphors in foreign affairs. So how wide is this river? Does it include taking out the supreme leader?
Well, I think that wouldn't be a wise thing to do. Okay, in existential conflicts like the Second World War, we did try to take out Hitler, but I think this is different. The avowed aim of the Israelis, and certainly the declared aim of the United States, is to dismantle the nuclear program, not to achieve regime change. And frankly, I don't think there's any capacity really to replace this regime in an orderly fashion with a new one. It's not like Syria, where the Assad regime with one push was toppled, but there was an organized militia in Idlib led by Ahmed al-Shara, who was able to come to Damascus and take control and exercise a degree of authority across the country. Unless the Israelis have got another big surprise for us, I don't think that they're organized group inside Iran. They must have quite a sizable, organized, structured cell that's operating on their behalf inside Iran. I'd be very surprised if they had the capacity for that group to take some form of power after a regime collapse. If the regime collapses, then, which is possible, then the best equipped elements of the armed forces would take over, and you'd have a military regime rather than an Islamic regime.
What about American strategy, which is how you described it? Is it, as Trump has said in the many things he has said about this in the past 3 days, is it to try to drive Iran back to the negotiating table?
Well,
is that plausible?
I hesitate about saying what goes on inside Donald Trump's head. We simply don't know what calculation he's making. It looks as though he has ordered everybody to be ready for this strike when he gives the say-so. I think he's probably quite enjoying being at the center of this story. There's a sort of personal, political aspect to this.
I may do it, I may not. Has the whole world watching?
Well, that's right, and that's what he likes. He loves the whole world to be watching. But we need to separate the comments that Trump makes in order to excite the media and to attract attention from the actions and decisions of the US system, of which he is the commander-in-chief. And I think that is the important one. And as I say, I think the Americans should frankly get on with it and get it over with, so that there's a chance, it reduces the chance of the Iranians shipping out more and more kit from Fordo and other sites into places where they can store it safely, and they'll certainly have those options, I think. And secondly, it gives a chance to say to the Israelis, look, we've now destroyed everything that we know of on the nuclear side. Stop going for regime change. It's just going to create total chaos inside Iran if you do that.
I don't want to go too much back into history because it is history and we are where we are, but I do want to go back to why the US came out of the nuclear deal that had been signed after all the efforts you described in 2015, and then came out of it 3 years later, despite many European leaders getting on the phone, even getting on planes to Washington saying, please don't rip this up. And I was looking back over the details of that and my own notes, and was struck by how prominent a role Netanyahu had played in saying to the US, look, this deal is never going to hold Iran back, come out a bad deal.
Which leaders were saying that?
Netanyahu was saying that to the US. Is this an avoidable situation? Could Iran have been contained by negotiation?
Well, as I said at the outset, if we could have found a negotiated way forward that carried Iran and the United States and the European powers and Israel together on this, that would have been a better outcome. There were lots of weaknesses with the 2015 JCPOA, as it's called, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
Yes.
The JCPOA, it didn't address the missile problem. Worst of all, it had a sunset clause where all the provisions for restraining Iran's nuclear program would have been sunsetting about now, so it would have run out. But I think Trump had some justified criticisms. The Republicans and the Israelis had some justified concerns about the JCPOA, but the alternative wasn't to walk away from it. The alternative was to build on it and strengthen it. But that's history, as you say.
It is history, but the reason I'm asking it is because of what it tells us about Israel's strategy, these series of conflicts that Netanyahu is pursuing. And I wondered where you thought this would lead for Israel in the end. We have on the other side the Saudis are constantly saying, look, there is another way, here is a normalization. If you stop all these conflicts, there is can be peace and acceptance within the region. But we have this constant conflict.
I don't think we should underestimate the depth of humility that Israelis felt after 7 October 2023. The entire establishment was responsible one way or another for the most catastrophic attack on Israel in their history. And I think I have got a lot of reservations about the brutality of the Israeli response in Gaza, but it's clear to me that the Israeli security forces are determined to ensure that there are no other militias within reach of Israel that could carry out anything like that themselves. And they are about, it's not so much preempting, because preempting carries the notion of an imminent threat, just preventing these threats from building up on their borders. And the biggest one of all was the prospect of an Iranian nuclear program.
Yes, and I don't think there is much dispute about that. So what happens now? The US comes in, or it doesn't? How far ahead is it possible to see on this?
Well, I think it's likely the Americans will initiate some strikes, and they'll be targeted overwhelmingly on the underground nuclear facilities. It may be that that is a time that a line can be drawn under this. The regime will be extremely angry. They'll look at ways to retaliate, and the threat against American establishments, Israeli establishments around the world from Iran will increase. We know the Iranians have got capacity overseas. We've seen in this country how a group of Iranian operators who seem to be doing so on behalf of the regime are trying to kill Iranian opposition figures and people appearing on radio programs broadcast into Iran, maybe attacking Israeli embassies and so on abroad. I think all these threats will go up because Iran will look for an asymmetric response to this. But they will do so from a position of relative weakness and in the knowledge that the Israelis have established a degree of military control over Iran, which will make them very vulnerable in the future.
What should the UK do?
Well, I think we've been involved in helping Israel protect itself from incoming Iranian fire, missile fire. We did that last year. I haven't seen any details of us being involved in that this year. I don't think we need to get involved in this, frankly. If American bombers do strike, they'll almost certainly go from Diego Garcia.
Well, the words have come up already. Yep.
Yeah, and, but the fact is, we've just negotiated a long-term deal so there could be an American base on Diego Garcia. I don't see Keir Starmer saying, but you can't use it, I'm afraid. I don't see that as being.
So you think that is a straightforward decision for him?
I think it's very straightforward. They've got an American base. The whole purpose of Diego Garcia being retained for that purpose is so that the Americans can use it when they need to use it, and so I think that's a straightforward decision.
Are there more complicated ones beyond that? Is it likely that the UK gets asked for more help?
We may be asked for some practical help. It depends how this whole situation evolves. We've got other facilities in the region, like on Cyprus, where we have military personnel and equipment. But I don't see the need for the UK to be pulled into this. And I would, if I was sitting in doing my old job in Number 10, I would say there's no need for us to get dragged into this, and we shouldn't be part of it. And I think that's been the posture of the Starmer administration up until now. We could have taken part in the military planning at CENTCOM, but as I understand it, British officers have not been involved in that, and so we're not party to the process. And I think that's not a bad position for the UK to be in.
Let me take a few questions. I think there will be a few. Let me take one on the aisle and one on the other aisle. Let me take those two together. Here.
So thank you very much. Peter Watkins, Associate Fellow at Chatham House. I just wondered, Sir John, if you could say a bit more about the wider geopolitics of this. I mean, if the Americans go all the way, as you put it, how would you expect Russia to react? And how would other key global players react? How could this, what could round two look like?
I think Rob was going to say.
And Rob is the second
Always
one.
nervous when a former British ambassador to Tehran is about to ask a question.
Thank you. I was going to introduce myself as a Chatham House Council member, not a former ambassador to Iran. So my question is, if you assume that this military action, with or without the Americans, is not going to lead to a regime collapse, and if you assume that the regime will still not entirely give up its nuclear aspirations, then do you see a possibility, however narrow, for the way this comes to a ceasefire eventually having a diplomatic wrapper around it that leads to some sort of negotiation that gets back into something like a deal that puts tight controls on Iran in return for a sort of lasting guarantees of various sorts and something involving sanctions. It seems remote, but the alternative is that we just have the prospect of renewed military action indefinitely.
Yeah, well, that's a very pertinent question. And when you embark on this sort of military action, those of us who are involved in Iraq, I see Jeremy here, there's a lot of uncertainty about what the aftermath of military action is, especially if it involves regime change. But I think in this situation, given your premises that there's an American military strike, the regime survives, and you then get to a new level of sort of stability in Iran, then I think, yes, there will have to be some form of consultation, some form of discussions with the Iranians. They will be very angry, very bruised, but they will have to come to terms with their new situation as well. So the possibility then of having some renewed approach, and the whole purpose of isolating Iran and imposing sanctions on it has been because of their nuclear program, because no one is convinced that their nuclear program is for civilian purposes. So I think there would be the possibility to do that.
I'm sorry, can we just go into because I think a lot of people are fascinated by just this point, but what brings Iran to the table at that point? It's been hit, a lot of its program dismantled, but the regime is still there. Why should it talk at all?
Well, because it would want to gain some form of sanctions relief and some capacity to behave like a normal country, given that the biggest threat that it poses has been removed or has been largely set back. And there will be, as you and others have implied, that there will be a possibility of Iran trying to reconstitute its nuclear program, and you want to negotiate that away as well. But you'd be starting from a much, assuming American strikes are broadly successful, you'd be starting from a much lower level of nuclear activity inside Iran.
You hope so, but as we've been discussing, really potentially quite hard to get rid of it all. This is a very big program over a long time.
But as we said, Bronwen, earlier, you may not be able to get rid of it all, but if you don't get rid of any of it, which is the current situation, then you're in a much worse position, given that we're halfway across this river.
Yeah.
So on Peter's point about the wider geopolitics, the Russians have indicated that they are not going to take sides between Iran and Israel. They have a dependency upon Iran for some of the supplies for the Ukraine war. They've also had a long-standing and quite close relationship with Netanyahu and the Israeli government, quite a cooperative one. And they can see that the Israelis are going to come out on top on this occasion. So they are not going to side with the losing side on this. So I don't think the Russians are going to come down heavily. They're certainly not going to prop up the Iranian regime, and Russia is almost as unpopular inside Iran as the UK is because of our part in dividing and occupying Iran during the Second World War. And I don't see the Chinese intervening either. The Chinese want stability in the Middle East. They want reliable energy supplies and cheap energy supplies. They get some of those from Iran. But the idea of China intervening to prop up a weak regime a long way from home in Beijing, I don't see that as being part of the Chinese game plan. So I think the Russians and the Chinese, whilst they would prefer the Iranian regime to survive, they won't mind too much about the damage being done to its nuclear program. They will be very resistant and critical of attempts at regime change. I don't think the Americans are going to go down that road, but they would certainly be critical of that, because of the uncertainty attached to it. But intervention, no, I don't see it.
Thank you. Let me take another couple. There was one here in the second row.
Thank you. My name's Laurianne Robinson, and I run the advocacy team consultancy. You referenced already the brutality of Israel's response in Gaza, and this week the BBC has reported about the IDF allegedly opening fire on civilians queuing for aid, which feels like a level that shocks many people. And yet it seems like the UK and the EU and others have been pretty ineffective in terms of protecting civilians and reducing civilian deaths. So in this moment, what more can we do, given the likelihood of conflicts escalating, both in Gaza and elsewhere?
Well, those are good observations, and it's a very valid question. I think some of the Israeli actions in Gaza are unjustified. This killings of people, Palestinians going to food centers, I think it's just incomprehensible, really, how those sorts of things happen. How can the Europeans intervene? I think we have to accept that Europe doesn't have a great deal of influence over Israel these days. There's been sanctions taken against individual far-right ministers. There have been measures taken to penalize Israeli practices in the occupied territories in the West Bank and Gaza. But there's a sort of root sympathy with Israel over what happened 20 months ago, and I think that shapes a lot of public opinion in European countries still. So what more can be done? I'm not sure there is a great more that can be done. There's actions of sort of demonstrative actions like recognizing a Palestinian state, which a number of European countries have done, but I'm not sure that actually changes the reality of the situation on the ground. I think we have to work on the humanitarian side, remind Israelis constantly that they have obligations here, and continue to support humanitarian relief as best we can. I hate to say it, I think the situation in the West Bank and Gaza is likely to get worse before it gets better.
Thank you. I'm going to take one here.
Thanks very much. Graham Butler from Chatham House. The initial rise in the oil price was presumably reflecting concern that the Iranians may take steps to constrain flows, and that hasn't happened. So could you say a little bit about the calculation as to why that's happened? And just on this question of the kind of geopolitical impact, what impact would the Americans taking out the Iranian capabilities have on either existing rogue nuclear powers or powers that were thinking of becoming rogue nuclear powers?
Creon, you know more about markets than I do, so I'm not going to speculate why the oil price hasn't risen further. I think part of the calculation is that although there has been some attention paid to Israeli strikes on Iranian oil depots and so on, actually it's been quite limited. There's not been much in the way of attacks against critical national infrastructure. And the Gulf countries have been very clear. They've heard the lesson, heard the message from the Iranians that if there are any strikes that involve their oil infrastructure, then the retaliation, especially if it involves bases in the Gulf, then the Iranians will have no compunction about striking those targets. People talk of a sort of terrible scenario of a ship being sunk in the Straits of Hormuz. Of course, if that happened, that would block off all Iranian oil exports from Bandar Abbas, and all of which are up the Gulf itself. So that's been raised a number of times over the last 50 years, and it's never actually happened. And I'd be surprised if it happened this time. What was your second point?
So basically about other rogue nuclear powers.
Oh yes. Well, it's an important point, actually, because a lot is being said now about how North Korea is safe, and Libya, Iraq, Syria, and now Iran are all being severely penalized for trying to have a nuclear weapon. I think the equation is pretty clear. And we saw in that spat between India and Pakistan last month, after the terrorist attack in Kashmir, that nuclear weapons is an equalizer between a smaller, weaker country and a bigger, richer, more powerful country, in this case Pakistan and India. And the Pakistanis were able to stand up toe-to-toe against the Indians, leaving aside responsibility for that terrible massacre in Kashmir. But the nuclear weapons were an equalizer. So I think the incentive to have nuclear weapons will be there. But actually my concern about nuclear proliferation throughout my career, it was all about difficult countries, whether it was apartheid South Africa or Libya or Syria or Iran and North Korea. Actually, I think the concern about proliferation now will be if the American defense guarantees to Europe and to East Asia and in the Middle East become hollow, then there will be more of our friends seeking nuclear weapons than those who are hostile to us.
We are going to have to stop there. I'm so sorry. There are loads of hands up and interesting questions online about why has it taken 100 years to get a female head of MI6.
Because it was a military organization organized by military structures. We're ahead of the armed forces and having a female head. And I think Blaise is an outstanding candidate, and she'll do brilliantly in the role.
All right. Thank you for that.